The Walking Dead Season 1 was quite good. While not perfect, it had some great characters to embark with on a satisfying journey that remained at least superficially true to the point-and-click adventure games it hailed from. So I was thrilled to hear that Telltale would be releasing a second season. But even though it wasn't terrible, even from early on, Season 2 did not click with me. I gave Telltale the season's duration to change my mind, but sadly I still feel largely the same way I felt when I finished Episode 1. Disappointed. So let's figure out why. First, the game is shorter by almost 2 hours. Not only is this a simple downgrade in value, it's a detriment to the pacing as well. This is due to a number of omissions. First, the puzzles are virtually gone. You use an easy to find and important to the plot knife to open a chest, sneak out of a shed, and search 1 or 2 environments for a single object of plot progression. That's it. Now granted, Season 1 definitely simplified the puzzle element from what point-and-click fans were accustomed to, but we still got some decent puzzles with a few really creative solutions. But apart from just being enjoyable, the puzzles did many important things for the game. They naturally increased the length of each episode, made the experience feel like an actual game, and, most importantly, they fleshed out the game world. Be it the pharmacy, the motor inn, the St. John's Dairy, the train, or Crawford, you learned about the settings you inhabited whenever you were given a task. This is because when a player is trying to solve a puzzle, he searches everywhere in the environment for a solution, and the details he finds teach him about said environment and its inhabitants. If that's too general, here's a specific example. I can say with relative certainty that I know more about Crawford, that survival of the fittest camp you visit for about half of episode 4 of Season 1 after it had already fallen apart, than I do about Carver's shelter that you spend almost the entirety of episode 3 of Season 2 in. And that's largely due to Telltale's use of the environment in the former and its refusal to do so in the latter. I mean, not only are there almost no puzzles in Season 2, but there isn't even much environmental detail that the puzzles could have compelled one to appreciate to begin with. With regards to Crawford, think of all the little environmental details you saw, like the flyers outlining the militant rules of the society. It felt like you were learning about an actual place, and it helped that you were given a pretty large area to explore. Then there's Carver's place, where you can easily go 10 to 20 minutes without walking around at all. When you do, you explore relatively sterile and very small locations. Your sleep quarters, a hallway, a comic shop, a roof, and Carver's office. That last one in particular could have had a lot of interesting things that could have subtly characterized Carver. Maybe a journal, a letter, a picture of him before this all began, but it's absolutely barren. Think of all the things we could have learned about this facility by just being able to examine it freely. We could have learned about how it fell from what seemed like a genuine attempt to rebuild society into the militant work camp with which we were all acquainted. Maybe we could have felt some conflict about leaving the place and or killing all its inhabitants. And episode 3 is just one example. This lack of care for the environment is prevalent throughout the entire season, and that's really detrimental because it puts a greater burden on the dialogue for telling the story. And that may have been okay if it weren't for the next omission, the optional conversations. Before, you were given numerous opportunities to talk to your fellow survivors while exploring the environment. You usually got 3 questions to ask each person at any one of the numerous opportunities in the episode. The answers were in-depth, and sometimes even became actual conversations. A year later, it's almost entirely gone. Only occasionally do you actually walk up to someone and hit the talk button like before, and it's almost always required, and there's never more than one dialogue thread to work with. This omission was a terrible idea because in Season 1 we learned so much about our fellow survivors via the ability to talk with them. Kenny's a fisherman who thinks using his boat might be a good plan. Ben's biggest fear isn't of death but rather of becoming a walker. Larry gets a vague but decently effective backstory from Lily that might just make you think twice about killing him should the situation arise. Those are all examples of vital stuff that gets reincorporated later. But let's face it, even trivial conversation gives characters character. It was an important part of Season 1, but it's gone in Season 2. The only interaction you are allowed with characters is what the story flat out requires. Think of it this way, the mandatory conversations you had with characters in Season 1 were the skeleton of their characterization, while the optional stuff was the meat on the bones. And the vast majority of Season 2's characters were like this guy. Bottom line, the strength of the first season was the relationships you developed with other characters, and now that's severely diminished. That's not to say that the season is devoid of developed characters. Kenny and Bonnie were already established in the first season and the subsequent DLC, so it's no coincidence that they are two of the more interesting characters. Then there's Jane, who, and I scrolled through the entirety of my footage before making this approximation, you jarringly spend about half of Amid the Ruins just talking to and learning about. Otherwise, there are some characters I wanted to learn more about, the majority of them in fact, but I never did, and that's not just a step back from Season 1. That's a huge problem for any story-centric game. Clementine is also a far weaker character in this go-around, which is a real shame considering that the big draw to Season 2 was playing as her. She was such an endearing character in Season 1, but this time she's very dull. It really feels like she has no character traits to call her own, and I'd say she really has only one or two memorable moments overall. Maybe it's the voice acting or the direction that's throwing me off, especially when compared to Season 1.
But it's like we're a team, like you said.
He taught me how to survive.
I'm just sorry for being mean.
What happened to him?
I know they're okay.
I'm sort of glad it got away.
We don't leave friends behind.
Why can't we do both?
What if it is someone's?
He deserved it. He was trying to kill us.
You might say that this is because she's a hardened veteran of the apocalypse, and that's true, but everything that made her so enjoyable in Season 1 is gone. If she ditched the hat and stopped quoting Lee, she might as well have been a completely different character, and a very bland one at that. The plot structure of Season 2 also leaves quite a lot to be desired. It feels like the writers just made up the plot as they went along. The prime example of this is Carver. They introduced this pretty interesting villain, building him up as the big bad guy of the season, and then they kill him off at the end of episode 3. I wouldn't mind this, except it really feels like the writers had no idea what to do afterwards. So they contrive Arvo into the story so we can have a cliffhanger shootout to close episode 4 with, and a reason for Kenny to get all pissy in episode 5. And then there's Jane, the girl whose life you have to value against Kenny's at the finale's climax. Rather than building her up throughout the season, they introduce her a little over halfway through, and, like I said, force feed you exposition about her all through episode 4. So if the final choice boils down to someone you don't even start getting to know until Amid the Ruins, and someone you knew before the season even began, what was the point of episodes 1 through 3? Simply put, there's no cohesion between the first and second halves of this season. They feel like two independent stories, with the former not having any satisfactory conclusion, and the latter feeling insultingly rushed. Another interesting area to compare these two seasons is in the way they handle choice and consequence. I've already said my piece on Season 1's handling of that in my review, and there's a much better and more in-depth video on the same subject I'd recommend if you aren't already familiar with the sentiment that the consequences to the choices you made were mostly superficial. I was interested to see how Telltale would adapt to the criticism they received. The result was overall a mixed bag. I'll praise a couple of moments. The sequence at the end of A House Divided was an interesting matrix of outcomes that partially came about through dialogue. Alvin's death ultimately wasn't telegraphed by a hit circle to sacrifice Alvin prompt. It came about if you didn't come to his rescue or if you egged Kenny on, making it more your fault. By the same token, Nick's fate depended on whether you defended him with Walter or not, again in seemingly inconsequential dialogue. That's neat and something Season 1 could have used. I also will applaud Telltale's handling of the way Season 2 ends. Instead of one great ending, you get 5 endings that range from decent to the one I got, which was very effective. Having said that, and even in comparison to Season 1, the consequences are an absolute joke, even and especially for the scenarios I just praised. If you save Alvin at the ski lodge, he disappears into Carver's joint until his death at the end of the episode. If Nick survives, he does nothing substantial in episode 3 and is suddenly a walker at the beginning of episode 4. Even if you save Sarah at the trailer park, she irreversibly dies at the end of the same episode without doing anything worthwhile for the hour she has left to live. Remember in Season 1 where saving Ben gave him the chance to stand up for himself in front of Kenny? And while Doug and Carly were interchangeable until their inevitable deaths, they still did contribute to the plot for 1.5 episodes after they were saved. Moreover, the aforementioned failure to adequately characterize most of the people in Season 2 really takes away the confliction in making most of these decisions. I remember at that riverbank at the end of All That Remains, I was utterly indifferent to the characters I had to choose between. I had only really learned anything about them over the past 5 minutes. In short, the choices and consequences were one decent step forward in concept, but one giant step back in execution. Execution really is the key word when talking about Season 2, and that's really frustrating. For all I know, the writers hashed out a beautiful script on par with Season 1, but once it got to the development stage, it was so streamlined that what we ended up with was only a shadow of what it once was. I refuse to believe that the writers initially intended to stick almost all of the 400 Days characters into meaningless cameos. I can't see why they would give us the option to rescue Sarah, only to do nothing with her afterwards. In short, I can't see Telltale comparing Season 1 to Season 2 and saying, yep, these products are of the same quality. So why did they do this? Well, we did sort of let them get away with it in the finale of Season 1.
The episode was substantially shorter, had almost no puzzles, and felt about as automated as most of Season 2.
But that worked, because the characters had all been established. This was the payoff that Telltale had earned. Plus, the roof of the hospital alone still had more optional dialogue than the entirety of Season 2. Telltale also skimped on the content in 400 Days. That's beatable in less than 90 minutes and has many of the same aforementioned omissions as Season 2. But 400 Days worked because each scenario knew what it was. A quick 15-minute snippet analyzing 1 to 3 characters dealing with one situation. Season 2, on the other hand, thought it could be just as comprehensive as Season 1 without embracing the finer details and subtleties. And given the fact that Telltale was also making The Wolf Among Us at the same time, I can suddenly see why they are willing to skimp on the specifics a bit. But that's me veering into speculation at this point. I'll reiterate, I don't think Season 2 was terrible, it had its moments, but in comparison to what came before, it really doesn't hold up. Simply put, a lack of care and passion on Telltale's part turned this into a very lackluster experience.